Christopher Pennant had passed through a crisis of faith. His time at seminary had not been enough to free him entirely from doubt, but it had given him the strength to go on. And when he'd taken holy orders, he had been both proud and relieved. While waiting for a parish of his own, he assisted Father Scarduto at St. Matthew's in Ottawa. This suited Christopher perfectly. He was himself from Ottawa, so some of the strangeness and pleasure of being called Father Pennant was offset by the familiarity of his surroundings. Whenever he allowed himself to think about where he might like to go, that is, where he might like his first parish to be, he imagined he'd be happiest in a small city of some sort, Cambridge, say, or Peterborough. So, he was dismayed when he was told he'd be going to a place in Lambton County called Barrow. He was not unhappy to be leaving the city, but the city was where he had lived out most of his life, and the word country, Barrow was in the country, was vague to him. It was a word that called to mind Cumberland, the town near which his parents had a cottage, the place where he'd spent his summers as a child. One evening in Toronto, the gods Apollo and Hermes were at the Wheatsheaf Tavern. Apollo had allowed his beard to grow until it reached his clavicle. Hermes, more fastidious, was clean-shaven, but his clothes were distinctly terrestrial: black jeans, a black leather jacket, a blue shirt. They had been drinking, but it wasn't the alcohol that intoxicated them. It was the worship their presence elicited. The Wheatsheaf felt like a temple, and the gods were gratified. In the men's washroom, Apollo allowed parts of himself to be touched by an older man in a business suit. This pleasure, more intense than any the man had known or would ever know again, cost him 8 years of his life. While at the tavern, the gods began a desultory conversation about the nature of humanity. For amusement, they spoke ancient Greek, and Apollo argued that, as creatures go, humans were neither better nor worse than any other, neither better nor worse than fleas or elephants, say. Humans, said Apollo, have no special merit, though they think themselves superior. Tancred Palmieri was sitting in the Green Dolphin, thinking about how best to dispose of a black diamond he'd stolen from a house on the bridle path. He was 25 years old, and he'd been a thief from the age of 11. But this was the first time he'd had difficulty deciding what to do with a stone. It was as if the diamond had a personality. Tancred was a tall and physically imposing black man, but he was also approachable. He could not sit anywhere for long without someone starting a conversation. This was, his friends liked to say, because his blue eyes were startling and his voice deep and avuncular. So, when he wanted to be alone without necessarily being alone, Tancred answered in French, his maternal tongue, when spoken to by strangers. Few who came into the Dolphin knew the language, but Willa Wazarian did, and she took the fact that Tancred spoke it as a portent. They would be friends. She knew it, and touching his arm, she blithely began to tell him about her family. In August 2017, I was eating an egg and cress sandwich when Professor Bruno called to ask if I'd help him in his travels through southern Ontario. I love watercress, nasturtium officinale. It's delicious, and it reminds me of my mother's garden, so I was already in a fair mood. Professor Bruno had been a friend of my father's. He was a kind man, one I'd known since I was a child. It would have been difficult to turn him down. The fact that his invitation came on the anniversary of my parents' death, a terrible accident on the 401, made it doubly hard to refuse. I would take my yearly vacation from the lab and spend part of it with the professor, one of the many mourners who'd wished me well at my parents' funeral. "I'm sure you find your parents' friends beyond boring," he'd said, "but I hope you'll look in on me from time to time. It'd be lovely to keep in touch." "Yes," I said. And a year later, I was happy to show him that I'd meant it, that I was glad to keep in touch. Guinevere Lloyd disliked Tancred Palmieri at first sight. There was something unsettling about the way he observed her, as if he were staring at a blemish on her face. Then, when their eyes met, he turned away, as if he lacked conviction, which made Gwen feel even more self-conscious. His friend Olivier, in contrast, was charming. He asked if she'd like a glass of wine, and, when she said she would, a coupe of Prosecco appeared, as if it had been waiting for her. "Is this okay?" he'd asked. And when she thanked him, he said, "My name's Olivier, and this is my friend, Tancred." Tancred had turned to her then and smiled. His demeanor changed. Now he seemed entirely at ease, confident. And why not? The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and handsome. His skin was dark, and his eyes were a bright blue. "It's nice to meet you," he said.